So, did you succeed? Let's do this together. And for that, I'll comment out all the code here. We could remove it, but I'll leave it here for reference. And instead, we'll now use the composition API. That means we'll start by adding this setup method, where we initialize all the data and functions and computed properties and watchers the composition API uses. And let's start with the data. We get 3 pieces of data here: available funds, current expenses, and the currently entered expense, which is bound with vModel to this input. Now, the available funds are hard-coded and will never change. The other 2 values, current expenses and entered expense, are dynamic though. They can change. Hence, we can make the first value a hard-coded value here as well. Available funds could be 100, and it doesn't need to be a ref or anything like that. The other 2 values should be refs, or you merge them together into a reactive object, whatever you prefer. I'll go for 2 separate refs, and therefore we can import a ref from view here, and then here we have our our current expenses, which initially is 0. That's the default starting value for this ref. And then we have our entered expense, which also is 0 initially. So now we got these 2 refs set up here. And we can now return them. We always need to return an object in the setup method, and there we add all the things we want to expose to the template. So in this case, I'll expose the available funds. Had a typo in there, so that should be available funds, the current expenses, and the entered expense, using that JavaScript shorthand where I don't need to write this, but instead I can just write this. With that, we're exposing all the data we need to the template. So the two-way binding should work automatically. The data binding here with the curly braces should also work here. This will not work, remaining funds, we don't have that yet. And add expense, this function, does also not exist yet. So let's maybe continue with that. Let's add a function for increasing our current expenses. So I'll add a new function, add expense, and in here I want to reach out to my current expenses, access.value, and set it equal to current expenses.value plus the entered expense.value. So what we currently have stored in the entered expense field. And the entered expense field is populated with help of vModel. So with that, we're updating the current expenses, and we now got the add expense function, which we now, of course, also need to expose to the template by adding it to this returned object. With that, we're still missing the remaining funds though. And the remaining funds were a computed property. Hence, they should still be a computed property here. And you learned how to create a computed property with the composition API. We import computed from view. And then, somewhere here, after we defined those refs on which we depend, we can get our remaining funds by calling computed and passing a function to it. And as a side note, it of course does not matter whether you use this function or this kind of function. Both works. So here I'm passing in a function, and I want to return the computed value in that function. That's what we have to do in computed. And the value we're interested in is the available funds minus the current expenses, now just implemented with the composition API. So available funds minus current expenses.value. Available funds, at least in my solution, is not a ref, therefore here it's not .value, but just available funds like that. Since we never changed this, it doesn't need to be a ref. With that, we calculate the remaining funds, and now we can expose those to the template as well. So add them to the return object here, and if we now save this, I seem to not use value in a place where I should be. Yeah, here I have a typo. That should be value, not values. So I had a typo here, but with that typo fixed, Now we can reload and we can start adding expenses, and this works. The only functionality which is missing now is that we add our watcher, which watches for our funds to become negative. Because that's a watcher we had here. We watched the remaining funds, and if they became negative, I showed an alert. Well, we can also implement a watcher with the composition API. For that, we need to import watch from view, and then here, after defining the remaining funds, since we will depend on them, I'll call watch and make it clear that remaining funds is my dependency by passing it as a first argument. And the second argument then is the function that should be executed whenever remaining funds change. And then here we get the new value and the old value for the watched property. And I want to check if the new value is smaller than 0. And if that is the case, I will just grab this alert from the options API and throw it here. Well, and that should be all. Now, I'm getting an error that old value is defined but never used. And indeed, I'm not using it here, I don't need it. So we can also omit it here, but you would be getting it, just in case you needed it. But with that removed, now we can reload and start adding some expenses, and this all works. But as soon as I go below 0, I get my alert thanks to the watcher. Well, and that is it. That is the old app, which used the options API, translated to the composition API. And we're using all those core and key features we learned about over the last lectures.